Hello and welcome to our lunch connection. My name is Nadine, and I will guide you through our two webinars today. Before we start, your microphones and cameras are disabled. Please feel free to ask questions via the Q&A button at any time. We will try to answer all questions at the end of each webinar at the Q&A session. The webinars are recorded. The recording and the presentations will be sent to you in the upcoming days. We are very happy to have with us today our esteemed colleague Arun Singh from India. Arun will share in both of the presentations his extensive experience with us, and we are very much excited for that. Now I will hand over to you. Welcome to the conference, Arun.
Thank you, Nadine, for such a wonderful introduction. And I think, thank you everyone for joining and welcome to this, lunch connection. And I think this is a wonderful topic, and it's very timely. And what's happening in a global landscape, it's very important to know, so that at least we can keep ourselves ahead of the curve and take appropriate call at appropriate time, and to manage the top line as well as the bottom line. Today I'm going to talk about what are the global macroeconomic scenario look like, and what is the credit risk outlook for 2022 and beyond. With that, let's move on today's agenda. We have a 5 broad agenda which I'm going to touch base. One, I'm going to talk about the macroeconomic outlook for 2022 and what are the factors who are going to define that outlook in 2022. The second agenda will be what are the top 10 key risks which businesses should be aware of, because those are the risks going to shape most of the 2022 and even the 2023. What we are watching in 2022, that's another element, and we should be aware about that piece. And the fourth, what are the country risks look like? What are the bankruptcy scenario looking like today? And what could be the delinquency risk today and what it means for tomorrow? And then fifth point, and this final one, is what are the leaders' guide for managing the risk? The first 4 points is certainly not going to be a very easy task. There's going to be a tough conversation. There's going to be a hard piece coming out from that, and what's happening in the market, that's reality, and we need to know those reality one side, and other side we have to take appropriate call to manage those concerns and leverage those opportunities. That's the piece we are going to discuss today. And with that, I'll move on the first part of today's agendas, that what has happened in 2020. Many countries declined. This is a GDP growth rate across select economies today. And if you see those select economies today, they were down in 2022, except few, China, and then there was Taiwan region was basically had a positive growth in 2020. That has created a supply chain, that has created an inflation, that has created slower than anticipated recovery. There's a consumption issues. A lot of issues were there. Fortunately, 2021, which ended few months back, was great. And we basically have seen many countries recover, very, very fast. Why? Because this was not an economic shock. This was a health shock. Unfortunately, translated in the economic shock through the lockdown measures, through those supply chain disruption, through those factory being shut down for a temporary period, and that created a pain across the border. That was the reason. But once economy started opening up, those economic growth came to the normal and we've recovered faster. But in the reality, in 2022, which is basically first month, most of the country are now equal to what we were in 2019, which means we are now back to 2019 period after 2 years, which means we lost 2 years of those potential output, and thus loss is not going to come back. Now, what it look for 2022 onward, those recovery is not even. There's still some of this market is high. There's China, you can see is basically slowing down, and the UK, Germany, France, and other European countries, along with the US, are basically coming down to the normal level. What we are saying is basically coming to the normal growth rate, which means we should be aware the recovery is taking place, but the recovery is not even. The recovery is uneven, and the recovery will take a different shape across different market, different geographies. Is not going to be the same what it used to be prior pandemic. Now the fresh concern come up in the form of Russia-Ukraine crisis, which means it's not controlled at this point of time. This GDP forecast was prior to Russia-Ukraine crisis, which means when we fully analyze what Russian-Ukraine crisis means to the global growth recovery through those commodity channel supply chain, this growth rate will be revised downward further, which means there is a scope for a downward revision, and that's another risk for everyone to be aware of. This is basically the GDP recovery across advanced economies, emerging market, and the low-income developing countries. Two growth curves. One pre-pandemic forecast done by various agencies, IMF, DNB, and many other research house across world. And there is a light blue line, which is basically done currently after the pandemic. It's a pre-pandemic forecast till 2023, and then during the pandemic forecast till 2023. If you see, the recovery is uneven. Advanced economies likely to achieve the pre-pandemic forecast by 2022 and 2023, whereas emerging market still they're not anywhere close to the pre-pandemic forecast, and same applies to the low-income countries. In fact, the gap is widened there. The rationale of this slide is that there will be recovery. There will be an improvement across geographies, across the countries, but those recovery will be uneven. Advanced economies with the vaccination, with health expenditure, with government support are quick to recover, whereas emerging market and the low-income developed countries will take a time to recover. We need to understand what are the factors who are going to basically shape this outlook, and to better synthesize those growth journey across countries, and some of those parameters which should be mindful. One, basically the vaccination across countries. For example, South America, if you see that 83% of the people are vaccinated. Oceania on other side is at least 66% of the people are vaccinated, whereas Africa is just 20%. That's a concern. And I'm going to highlight that concern later on. But there's a positivity. If you look at majority of the world have basically achieved where the 63% of the global GDP comes from the high income. They've basically vaccinated the people, and that's provided the good consumer support, optimism in the consumer, and that's supporting the GDP growth across countries. In spite of some of this wave, what the Omicron we had, Delta we had, and then many other wave across many countries. What is positive things that the government have realized and the people have realized that there's no point in locking down the country. The stringency index, if you see, 1 year back in January 2021, that used to be something around 68%. Now today that number is around 30-35%, which is great number, because I think almost half of the government are not even into that mode, in spite of some of those COVID cases. COVID cases going up, but the government is not basically putting the lockdown, which is great. Easing of the measures. Another factor who supported the recovery is going to support the recovery, the push across countries in terms of fiscal support. Advanced economies, they went something 45% of their percent of the GDP was supported, was basically pushed into what you call to support the company got impacted through the pandemic. Italy, Japan leading the pack. Even the emerging markets, some of those countries, if you talk about the Brazil, they're more than 10%. India, for example, more than 10%. Indonesia, more than 10%. So one time, this is a big fiscal support government across countries have provided, and that has that supported the recovery plan, and that's going to continue. Another element which the factor going to shape recovery phase is the consumer confidence. This is just for interest of space. We just put together 6 countries. There are many countries, more than 30 countries, where we have consumer confidence data that shows the consumer confidence is going up. And of course, there are some third wave, fourth wave across countries. But in spite of the fact that there is still COVID on the planet, the consumer confidence is going up, or at least started improving for what we have seen in 2020 and early part of 2021. That's going to support, recovery across countries, and that's a piece one has to be monitored carefully. And then fifth factor is basically the wealth effect. If you see the wealth effect in Great Depression, if I have to take example of S&P 500, it took more than 6,000 days to come back to the normal, that one index. During dot-com bubble, it took almost 1,800 days to come back to the normal. Global financial crisis, it took more than 1,300 days. But in the COVID, the biggest support we had from that piece that it took just 127 days to come back to the normal, the pre-pandemic level. So which means it's just 3 to 4 months, it came back to the normal, index performance. That's a great achievement here. And I think we should be, happy about that piece, because it's not what we have seen in the past, in spite of the fact that it's the biggest health issues in a century. It's better than the global financial crisis because it was not economic shocks. It was a health shocks, and that I think company have decided to move on. Now that brings to the point, what is the basically element we should be worried about, and what is the element we should be talking about at this point? The top 10 risks which we should be focusing, and that's going to shape some of our thought process in 2020 and 2023. So this global financial, so there are 10. The first one is the global inflation. Sorry, it's not financial, global inflation. There's two things. Before the Russian-Ukraine crisis, the global inflation was started going up. We have seen in the last year, the Europe, the fuel prices have shot up, and they shot up significantly. And I have some slide to show that how that big could be and how that's going to impact. And the Russia-Ukraine crisis is going to add more to this one because of this commodity route, fuel price, and then there's an import dependency, and the most of sectors are energy intensive. They're dependent on the Russian import. That's going to have an impact, and then we have to basically monitor carefully. Inflation is basically one input. What is outcome of that? Outcome of that, most of the central bank across countries are going to basically react by increasing the interest rate. In fact, the UK and then Fed have already started doing this one. That means the lending cost will go up. This means that emerging market sovereigns and then corporate will see the sudden surge in their debt servicing cost as international liquidity recedes and the domestic rates rise to keep the risk premium intact, which means the company whose are basically loan dependent, the debt servicing will going to be a big challenge, and that's a piece I think one has to be watchful and careful. The second risk is basically resurgent COVID-19 waves. It's not about going down, or it's not about subsiding, but there's a concern that this will come up, and this will come up again. And no matter how government is prepared, this COVID wave in terms of the new variant is going to create a problem. So there is a need that the government across countries are monitoring that and keeping a tab on that, which means it's a risk worth watching. The third is basically China economic slowdown. China's insistence on a zero tolerance policy to COVID-19 has, if you see, the necessitated the sealed borders and on-off disruption to the business activity. And in fact, if you see the Q4 number of China, that's growth is tapering down. So the many countries who are exposed to the China export and import, and they have a supplier and the buyer based of the China, and thus continent is going to be impacted, which means this is space one has to be carefully watching in 2022 and 2023. The climate policies. We know that there's a confusion about the use of the coal and then the direction of the energy policy in the Europe and Asia and most of the other market, because that's going to take maximum uncertainty, in uncertain environment about where to put money, where not to put money, whether ESG concept is there. Now with the Russian-Ukraine crisis, where the energy dependent country will have a trouble in terms of meeting those, use case will certainly create a pain. We have a COP26 things coming up. That's a piece which is not clear, at least in some of those countries outside Europe. And if you have a trade, then it's worth watching. Then fifth one is the cyber issues. That's a part of technological threat, but geopolitical scores, in fact, are increasingly, settled in the cyberspace. We have seen that, and people go beyond governments. In fact, the private businesses that serve critical national infrastructure are also targeted. We have seen Israel, Taiwan, US. There are many companies have raised those alarm in the past, and that's going to create issues. And company are literally exposed to those cyber vulnerabilities, and one has to take care of that in terms of the data, in terms of security, in terms of those over exposure to companies who are basically further overexposed to cyber vulnerabilities. That's one thing. Now, the fifth part is the supply in the Russian-Ukraine crisis. Now, I have a couple of slides later to explain that that's not basically going to subside in a short span of time. Even there's a consensus of the people of government across countries reaching consensus that the war stop, the damage done, and the trade impact, the sanction issues, that's going to take a serious issues. And there is a lot of concerns in terms of after war, in terms of the commodity price, the people who are dependent on those commodities imported from Russia is going to be a painful scenario. And then the seventh one is basically US-China competition. There's concerns about the Chinese military manual over the Taiwan region and then South China Sea, and there's rapidly growing issues in terms of the arms and ammunition happening across the countries. And there is a concern in terms of the tariff, in terms of those competition between US and China, from a trade route perspective. It's not a new, it's there for a few years. That's going to create a major uncertainty across countries and going to have a repercussion during this trade route. Many companies are exposed to this trade route, will have issues around that piece. And then we have political polarization issues where many element around that piece, COVID appropriate behavior, or lockdown, or giving those human aid, because many companies are suffering, small scale companies, the people losses. There are going to be massive social unrest across various countries who are exposed to this type of issues, where the economy is not recovering and there is a benefit being provided to those sections. If they're not, then there will be going to be social unrest. The second last is basically the politics in the EU. There are many elements. There's many blocks, as you are aware about in the EU. They're basically happening in terms of, old laws and with the new things, and there's a fight over the budget, there's immigration issues, there are many things happening, and that's creating a scenario for the populisms. And, there's a strain, could be, one has to be watchful in terms of the Brexit perspective, that how that Brexit things is going to unfold and what impact is going to create on the company operating across this market. There are three big issues one has to be very careful in this one. The fiscal strains. We have a concerns being from core European countries to the southern European countries, and after this Greek debt crisis, then we have an institutional strain, the differences between core European countries and the Eastern European countries such as Poland, Hungary, on top in the rule of law, judicial independence, and immigration. That's what things happening. And security strains, basically. There are many things happening, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They are basically, somewhere in the middle of the US, Russia and Ukraine crisis, and there are going to be issues around those pieces. Those are the things one has to be careful and watching. And the last risk is basically supply chain risk. The supply chain risk is not going to subside today. I think started from pandemic, is everything stopped. and there's a wave of pandemic. Then we have a Suez Canal issues. Then we had what you call China zero COVID policies, and there's some of the port they shut down, and this impacted. Now today the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and that's created a pain. This is going to stay for long and will certainly create a pain, and that's one of the top 10 risks which everyone has to be watchful and careful about this one. Some of those detailed specific note on those highlighted risks which I talked about are basically the public debt. If you talk about public debt, it's good that government across world, across countries, they basically moved forward and supported their companies, and through the fiscal support and other stuff. As a result of that, the public debt for advanced economy is almost close to the World War II level. Now, just imagine that their interest rate going up, debt servicing will be difficult and will certainly create a pain for most of those advanced economies. They can manage, but if there's not, then there is a serious issue, and that will have a serious repercussion in those countries. The second thing is that while the vaccine, there are significant portion of the vaccine, people have been vaccinated, but there is a vaccine inequity. For example, 2 in 3 people have been vaccinated in the high-income countries, whereas 1 in 7 people have been vaccinated in the low-income countries, which means unless we vaccinate 100% of the people, those travel restriction will happen, those movement of the people across the countries will be restricted, or will have a concern about the spread and other elements, which means that's another headwinds one has to be basically careful. Those inflation I just spoke about. If you see in the shocks, if I have to talk about from impact of inflation in terms of the shock, that output is down by 1 percentage point, whereas inflation is up by 1 percentage point. So your output is down, whereas inflation is up. That's certainly not a good sign for the recovery piece. And this is going to be a more painful when we talk about those commodities shortage, energy shortage as a result of Russia-Ukraine crisis. Inflation, this is the prior to Russia-Ukraine crisis because data is still unfolding. Look at the energy cost contribution to the overall inflation. For US, this used to be something anywhere between 50 to 70% of inflation was contributed by just energy prices. Europe, if you see, 3.5 out of 4.4 inflation. Other advanced economies, 1.6 out of 2 inflation. China, 1.6 out of 2.2. So you can see more than 50% of the contribution coming from just one commodity, that's energy. And that's really very serious issues, especially after Russian-Ukraine crisis. That's going to create another pain for the company operating in this space. And then there is a food security and energy crisis because of the Russia crisis. There's the import dependency. This is a EU nation. If you see, the horizontal axis basically oil and gas import from the Russia, in the 2020, there's a percentage. And then vertical line is energy import dependencies. The right top corner, they are overexposed country in terms of Russia dependency in terms of the energy. If something goes wrong tomorrow, then these are the countries who basically have a serious impact in terms of their energy, unless they find a different route to get the import supply from some other countries. The other side, if you talk about the wheat, coal, barley, crude petroleum, there are a list of countries who are dependent in terms of the Russia and Ukraine supplies. So 25 countries are dependent on the wheat and muslin for their piece. If anything goes wrong, these are the countries who are going to be impacted. It's not just country. There's a company who are operating in that sector, in that country, will seriously have a serious trouble because they are dependent on the Russia and Ukraine crisis, and anything can happen after this one. If you see, we watching the DNB data scores across all those countries who are exposed to the Russian energy. And, it's basically, you can see there are 3-4 scores. There are payment delays, there are probability of default, then the supplier stability index. You can see, as of now, there are many average companies across countries are green, which means not to worry about those scores for those countries, for those sectors, which is fine. But there's a medium risk. If you talk about those amber, there are quite big number who are basically at a medium risk, which means anything goes wrong from today, the company operating from that country in that sector are overexposed to the Russian-Ukraine crisis are going to have a serious trouble. And anyone operating from a supplier side and vendor side has to be watchful. Now, there are very handful of number. You can see the red, that's basically supply stability index in the mining sector, in the manufacturing sector, in the construction sector, in the oil and gas sector, in the Finland. If you see, they are red, which means the company operating in the sector, in the country, their supply stability score is already very, very high, which means it's very risky if the company is operating in that sector. That's a piece actually we should be watchful and careful looking at that. Now, moving on, the another agenda of the day, that what we are watching today is that basically few things. One, the business failure is basically on the rise. In 2022, business failure is mask. What normally we talk about is a real indication, because of the government support, because of the company got the benefit from government measures, and that most of us basically did not get the enough data point, or enough what we call a real scenario from the ground, because it was masked. But now that things are changing, now the government has started unfolding those elements, and there is going to be a serious wave of the business failure, because we have seen some of the crisis period in the past. Every crisis is followed by a significant surge in the business failure, and that's 2022 is going to be a one of those years. Now, adding to that, Russian-Ukraine crisis, that's going to create another pain, and that things is going to disturb. And we need to watching those space. Every data should be watchful. There's a second piece we are watching, the compliance. We looked at our database. There is a inquiry coming for the compliance piece in our database. That inquiry gone up by 50% as compared to 2019 level today, because there is a really, people want to be knowing whether the vendor or customer is compliant of the law of the land, or there is some issues, or these are some of the incipient red alerts where we normally advise a customer that you have to be very careful in order to stay ahead of the curve. So that's basically compliance piece is growing concern. The companies strengthen the global value chain resilience. I think we have seen the companies struggled during 2020 after the pandemic and Suez Canal issues, China issues. They are basically spending money and energy to strengthen their global value chain, so at least they are not able to, they are able to stand the next wave of supply chain disruption. There is basically, initiatives being taken by the companies to strengthen their value chain. And I think that's what's happening in 2022. There's a many factor we have to be very watchful, that they're going to keep inflation rate elevated, which means one has to be aware of. And I just said that in the climate policy, that COP26 is going to see how the climate economics are going to be accelerated, and one has to be basically, because that's provide opportunity as well as the risk. Opportunity that companies are going to invest and going to leverage on the piece. Risk, basically the company is not following that and country is not following that, what it mean for that piece. So that's one thing. And the last, watch the space, that what we call SME, because SME is already impacted from the 2020 pandemic perspective. While the government has provided support, but that's not going to be permanent. That's going to come back, and government has to roll back. And there's inflation issues happening, there's the interest rate is going up, and there's a debt servicing problem happening for the SME side. So this is a space that's going to be a painful for 2022, and it's very important to watch that space. Now, some of high risk, if you see, those country risks, those bankruptcy, those delinquency, that the second last section I'm going to talk about, is that Look at this chart. Is it changing? This is two period. We have a January 2020 and we have a February 2022. It's a 2-year period. This is basically, we do the country risk rating. There's a credit risk, which means whether your vendor and supplier is healthy if operating out of that countries. What is the probability you'll get supply from that supplier on a time, and whether your customer will be able to pay or not. That basically one metric. So if you see, the dark color and the dark brown is basically more of a risky country, whereas the lighter color is more of a low risk country. If you see, in February 2022, there are more countries who are basically of a high risk categories. Look, in last 2 years, the color coding have changed and they shifted from a more green to the more dark. This is a space one has to be basically careful because changing every day. The bankruptcy, and let's say the indexed value in 2013 is not showing up. As I said earlier, that's artificially low because of this massive fiscal and monetary support by the government, but those things are unfolding. And that's the trend we expect will reverse, which means the bankruptcy is likely to go up starting 2022, because that's not the space we have seen in the historical crisis period, that every crisis followed by the higher amount of bankruptcy, and that's the things we should be careful in watching. And then the third point is the delinquency risk. Delinquency risk is basically how the companies are paying to their supplier. If you see that their higher delayed payments shot up in the France, India, Germany, Canada, UK, and US in the early days of 2020, and in fact this improved. India, if you talk about France, if you talk about this, improved. But then let's say, for example, US, Germany, it's still it's a higher level and it's trying to go up. The idea is that there is no single rule book that each country will follow some definite pattern. Each country is expected to follow different pattern, and that's what this chart talks about. We have a data across many countries, but for the interest of that space, we just put the 6 countries as an indicative purpose that delinquency is going to create a pain for most of the countries because of those recovery, Russia-Ukraine crisis. We have to see that which country is following what route, especially which country, which sector. Because it's not just the country, also if you look at the sector, there's a huge variation. For example, France, if you talk about, manufacturing sector is doing good, but transportation sector is the worst. 14% of the companies are paying beyond 91 days due date. This is as on recent data. Whereas the finance, retail, wholesale, they are manageable. Same thing across sector, across country, if you see the different. Manufacturing in the Germany and UK, they are absolutely fine, no issue. But if you look at the US, there are 39% of the people are basically, percentage of the paying beyond due dates, which means there's no single rule book that each company, each country or each company will follow, each sector will follow same pattern. There's a different pattern, which means when I have to see and observe what pattern country and sector is following, so as at least we stay ahead of the curve. That brings to the last section for the today's, that what it mean for us. That means that there are 5 things we should be doing in this space. One, the first thing is basically that onboard an appropriate balance of risk. That there's a economic risk that's a prolonged, it's more than 2 years, right? And whether you want to allocate or give a credit to your customer or you want to change your pattern, there is a need to reassess your company's credit policy to recalibrate the risk profile of your new and existing customer. Your customer is not the same customer what you had 2 years back. The customer have changed, the vendor have changed, the environment have changed, which means if you're running the same day-to-day credit policy is not going to change, which means looking at those potential bankruptcy and then other element, these are the things one has to be very careful, and these are the things where basically one has to reassess their credit policy because things have changed. The second, the consider supply chain data. Now, there's a need for a comprehensive risk assessment and the supply chain data. Basically, it's not enough to know the financial strength of your customer or your supplier. The need is that what is the financial strength of the suppliers and their entire ecosystem, because one person, one companies are not able to supply goods and are based out of a country or based out of the sector where is a trouble or is going to be trouble after Russian-Ukraine crisis, or any commodity issues are going to create a pain. An entire supply chain is going to be disrupted, which means look at this data. What is your plan B? That you have to be basically ready with your near shoring and offshoring, or basically looking at those risk metrics. What is the alternate methods? All those elements are required, which means look at the supply chain data carefully. Third is maintain the customer relationship. Basically, I just said that customer is no longer the same customer what we had 2 years back. The customer have changed. Our sales folks, the finance and other internal team members are staying close to customer or nearby customers place. I think that's going to help and that's going to benefit, to know your customer better and basically stay ahead of the curve. That's one thing. The fourth, perform ongoing portfolio management. It's the same thing about, look at deteriorating credit scores, the legal events, basically establish those red alert that is there any credit risk associated with that particular account or no, that's fine. But then if the some red alert, what the red alert means, because your compliance issues, your bankruptcy issues are giving enough signal before the event. So it's important to watch those events. The third is basically the fifth, sorry, to get back to the basics, the 5 C's of the credit. Look at this: character, capacity, capital, conditions, and then collateral. That the need, I think most of you are basically aware of what it means, but that means that look at, find about the analytics, automated solutions to understand the credit terms and help your credit teams and, supplement provide some supplement to the sales for the finance folks to, have a comprehensive credit approach, do this comprehensive credit analysis across the spectrum, and look at what economic impact is going to have on your supplier and then customer. Basically, all those core issues of the credit basically has to be looked at and looked at from analytical angles. That's the one piece I think we should be careful. What is the key takeaways from this? I think reassess your risk management strategy. Don't try to fit everything into the same bucket. Things have changed, pandemic have impacted, everyone. You reassign those strategies and think differently. Establish the red alert, which means know your customer from the alert perspective. If there any something unexpected things going to happen, it's good to monitor that. It's good to keep a watch on the business network from a supplier side to customer side. Look for the country risk rating across the countries. And fifth, and very important, is basically partner with the analytics expert to keep your business up to speed, because I think there's a multiple data set. How does all the data come together and using analytical tool to give some insight and some analysis? That's very helpful, and that's need of the hour today.
Welcome back. I hope you had a pleasant lunch break. We continue here directly with the second lecture to the supply chain vulnerability with Arun Singh.
Thank you, Nadine, and welcome back, as Nadine said that. And this is a continuation of previous discussion, what we had. And I touched base a couple of slides on supply chain disruption. And today we are going to talk about more on the supply chain and how to keep a tab on that and how to basically sail through or prevent some of those elements and what are the actions required for us. Before that, I think it's worth to note that supply chain is not going to go away. Supply chain vulnerabilities and disruption is not going to go away. It's basically the part of the businesses, and some event will be more impactful, some event will be less impactful, but that's going to stay here. Need of the hour that how far we are aware about those events, and so that at least we can take a call. So today we are going to talk about FIRE agenda as like in the previous presentation, same thing, that what are the events of supply chain disruption we have seen. The most important today is in everybody's mind, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, what it means for the new supply chain disruption after the pandemic, and what procurement leaders are prioritizing. That's based on the DNB proprietary survey, and how ESG data can provide an important clue. In the last presentation, I was talking about the red alerts from the credit risk perspective. Here, some of those data points can be established as a red alert from the ESG perspective, ESG as a red alert from a supply chain disruption perspective. And the last is the how to prevent those disruption. Now, moving on the first slide. If you look at this, this slide is basically global supply chain pressure index. This is done by Fed, and if you see that's going up, and those going up sharply. That was basically, if you go back somewhere in the 2020, starting to pandemic, that shot up, but it came down as the lockdown eased, but then again shooting up. The idea is that when you talk about from computer chips to placements to construction materials, the world still coping up with the supply chain shortage triggered by what we call the pandemic. Even the aid organization have struggled to distribute the food and other stuff. That's basically the impact of supply chain disruption we have seen. Some of those events, if you talk about during the first lockdown, if you look at this, it's not just uniform supply chain pressure index we had. There's a variation. US we had a different, Euro area had a different, the China has a different, UK has a different. And this first lockdown, you can see the Suez Canal obstruction, and then China, because of the China zero COVID policy, you have seen there's a port closure, there's a disruption, and then now the Omicron wave. And then the fifth one is basically, of course, the Russian-Ukraine crisis. The idea is those supply chain pressure index varies from an event to event, country to country, and region to region, and it's good that we should be aware of that piece. Now, what it means for the, for us, because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, if you see, there's a distribution of a company in the Russia and Ukraine who are basically supplier to the world. They are basically largely from services sector, followed by the wholesale trade, construction sector, manufacturing sector. So this is sectoral cuts. These sectoral cuts are basically showcase, as I was talking about in earlier stuff, that they are supplier to the world economy. It's very important that if your supplier belongs to this particular sector, in fact, everyone is going to be impacted, either the direct or indirect, but it's good that we should be aware about those facts. When you look at some of those tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, at least you can see the 1%, something around 1%, Canada, Italy, Australia have those supplier based out of Ukraine, more than 1% supplier based out of Canada. That's those who are exposed to the Russian-Ukraine crisis, and they're going to be impacted. And there's going to be a painful from a supply chain perspective. These are the basically list of the country who are exposed to Russia and Ukraine supplier, and they're basically, their cash flow will be impacted, and there are basically any issues happening from Russia and Ukraine crisis fallout. These are the countries going to impact it because they're exposed to the customer is based out of Ukraine and Russia, or they're getting the supplier. They are basically list of these countries. And I just explained in the previous chart, this is the energy import dependency countries who are going to be a painful. I think we spoke last time, and many people have asked about those pieces, that why those ratings still not reflecting, because that was a pre-Russian-Ukraine crisis. Now data is unpacking data is available about whether energy crisis is going to create a pain, what is those supplier and customer look like, those rating will be impacted. More important, those countries belongs to energy intensive, the sector belongs to energy intensive sectors will have a major impact. It's good that we should be careful and watching that space. Now, that brings to the second part of the explanation. That's basically what procurement leaders are talking about today. If you talk about the procurement leaders today, there's many elements they're talking about. One thing is basically we reached out to more than 1,000 procurement and supply chain leaders across range of industries, multi-country survey. It is positive sign that almost all the organizations responding to this survey, was 98%, was basically now carrying out some form of supplier risk assessment. In fact, it's a beneficial exercise that helps protect business and help to protect businesses from the kind of financial and reputational damage that comes from the supplier failing, being unreliable, or having bad actors within their own supply chain. To address the challenge with the level of efficiencies, many organizations now employ what we call artificial intelligence, automation, or the continuous monitoring of the supply risk impact. You can see the 40%, 41% people have basically said that one. This ongoing practice is vital. In fact, failing to regularly monitor supply risk level may lead to organization being exposed to unknown or unforeseen threats. Less reliable method of risk assessment is using supplier risk assessment, let's say questionnaire, something 39% percentage of respondents still rely on that, which means more and more people are going to the ongoing monitoring, AI technology, and then automation. That's basically survey coming from what we have done in last few years. Moving on to next piece. Yeah. So managing supply data is growing into an increasingly complex challenge for organizations. In fact, almost all procurement professionals surveyed, around 98%, struggle with some area of their supply data management. Procurement teams often must manage vendor records in multiple systems and make manual updates, which can create both data quality and reporting issues. Staying on top of changes to supply data that require sophisticated data governance practice, as well as the right technology to support multiple regions and system where application, where it's basically applications running and it's applicable. When we asked the respondent, the area respondent indicated that they struggle with most is frequency of supplier record updates, which fifth, 1/5 of those procurement professionals cite as their leading issues, which means integration of disparate data sources and inadequate supplier intelligence is basically second and the most challenging task. That's basically challenges they are facing, which means it's a good piece. Then we know what are the problems these companies are facing. The automation, if you talk about, that's continued to remain the high priority item across all those organizations, as I spoke earlier. And there is a higher potential of what we call the company, the process leader believe that most potential to be automated is supplier management data, master data, followed by supplier onboarding and supplier risk assessment. All three priorities, if you talk about, they are interdependent. They are linked each other, and basically they reinforce each other. And there's a need that we should be conscious about that fact. Now, what are the priorities for the longer term? When we ask this procurement team or supply chain professionals that, what is the plan to improve your management of their operation? Better management of expenses and improvement working capital is the most cited priority. That's around 42%, if you can see. The second was basically building more resilient supplier network. And another interesting observation was that they are not seriously considering the other ways to improve efficiency outside of simply cost cutting or laying off employees, indicating that more firms are aware of other saving that can be made by better optimizing their supply chain through technology. That's basically things coming from directly supply chain professionals across market, and this is through the survey. How we can basically use some of those ESG data, and that how can be important clue or indicator to show that there is some issues happening in the supply chain. Otherwise, one can take a appropriate call on a time in order to ensure that things are things are moving as per the expectation. uh, there is a mounting pressure to meet the demand in terms of the supply shortage. The companies, they need to regulate their, in fact, they follow the regulation, the requirement regarding the environmental and human right practices. Effective supply chain management mandates additional tracking of these issues. So what we call environmental and social and governance, that's ESG, that provide good reliability, and that's good practice. One should think about it. That's basically, those are the element one should be watching, and that's provide good leading indicator. We have done one research that try to explore whether ESG data can also will be helpful in identify high risk supplier that may not be responsible or desirable business partner in terms of their business practices, as well as whether they can provide reliable and quality services. For both public and private companies, there is a strong positive correlation between good ESG performance and return on sales growth. A reliable indicator of a company's stability over the 1 to 3 and 5+ year period. That's a powerful on that. That's a usefulness of the ESG data when it comes to looking at where your partner is reliable or not. The financial performance in another important features to monitor that piece. In particular, the professional delinquency rate is helpful indicator of the reliability of a company's. It's like a credit score. The more late payment a company makes, the higher its delinquency rate, and the more unreliable it may be in terms of ranking of private companies. Revealed that companies with poor ESG performance had notably higher delinquency rates than with the good performance. So there's a correlation. You have ESG data, you have a delinquencies rate, and that's basically whether your partner is reliable or not. These all are interlinked. So it's very important to monitor the ESG data across the countries and how the delinquencies rate is moving on. That's very important piece to look at apart from the financial data. That's showcase how reliable your piece. We also compared some of the ESG ranking score against our supplier risk scores, including the DNB supplier evaluation risk rating, which predict that the long-term financial health of a supplier. And then DNB supplier stability indicator, which predict the what you call the 90 days financial and operational health of the supplier. The company with poor ESG performance are more likely to have a high risk of a future company inactivity. So how ESG can be embedded into our decision making is very important tool for us to understand your vendor is reliable, where a supplier is reliable or not. So also channel, what procurement team is doing, that the survey that they are looking for the more of a data, master data management, automation tool, analytical method, all they're using, but they're also using ESG data. They're also using some of the delinquent performance of the companies to keep ahead of the curve, because those are the red flag for companies that possibly there are issues happening on that front. Be careful on that piece. Now that moves to the last part of what are the best practices one can do to prevent those disruption across the market. That's the 5 things it makes important and critical to be aware about. That what it mean for supplier professional, that and what are the action items they should be taking. The first, develop a risk-based assessment process to basically identify specific risks that could impact your productivity and your supply chain. Look at entire channel, entire what you call those value chain, and develop those risk-based assessment, because if that's not happening, then certainly that's going to impact your own productivity, because your supply chain is impacted, and then I think things have basically has to be very careful on that front. The conduct an assessment that maps out your supplier and their supplier. As I said, that one instances in terms of tier one, tier two suppliers. Your tier one supplier could be basically linked to you, and they're supplying goods. But tier one has a tier two supplier, and that unfortunately, based off the country, you got impacted. If your tier two has a multiple relation, that certainly if the tier two supplier is not great, or there is some specific risk, probably your tier one also have a concern. So it makes immediate sense that one has to be very careful and watching that space, not just tier one, tier two and the entire chain, to understand that is not just your supplier, it's also the supplier is impacted or not. Take appropriate action around that front. And third piece is basically, again, I spoke earlier, this continuously monitor your supply chain. I think there's a need is not just one-time activity. It's ongoing activity, and those ongoing activity should be given a high priority when there is uncertain environment. The last 2 years, there's uncertain environment, and these things are going to deteriorate further, because the Russia-Ukraine crisis is not going to subside. The impact of that is not going to subside in the short term. That's going to be many company will be impacted from a tier one, tier two perspective, from a direct route and from a sanction route. So it's always good to monitor those supply chain issues continuously. Third, and the fourth piece is that keep your alternate supply ready, in terms of if the countries is basically or supplier based on X countries or X sectors are not able to provide goods, it's always good to have those mapping ready from a sector perspective, from a country perspective. If not, who else is going to provide? Because the companies, sectors are struggling based on high dependency in terms of the energy on the Russia. Those are the companies have to look for the new alternate vendor supplying goods outside Russia. So which means one has to be careful and watching those space, that which country, which sector will be alternate supplier available. The fifth and very important piece, that invest in the data analytics. And I think there's a supplier, the procurement officers are basically talking about that there's a challenge from a disparate system. There's a distributed team, there's a suppliers, and then higher volume and the velocity of data. That's basically challenging. The data analytics and use of the high-end analytical tool will certainly help to manage those supply chain risks, because with everything is not just the data, it's also about some of those unspoken data, some of those qualitative signal will convert into the data and will basically provide insight and support. So we'll keep everyone ahead of the curve to understand, because that comes, I think there is a good amount of investment required in terms of the data and analytics. Understand your supply network better from the analytical angle perspective. And then basically there are some of key risks that's, I basically talked about, that what we had yesterday, the economic scenario have changed completely. And the supplier chain risk is going to stay here for some time. And some of those volatility in the supply chain will be huge. It's always good to basically keep us ahead of the curve and monitor your supply health, and monitor those red flags and those what you call the early signals and signs that will help to keep companies ahead of the curve. There are various tools available, at DND side. We'll talk about the macro level, talk about the macro level predictor. Those are the future of some of those future oriented, some of the scores. Those will be basically helpful. there are some of those useful resources I think we'll share with everyone after this presentation, so one can go through that, where we can get the, some of those help from the DNP sides. With that, I'll move on the final section on the Q&A. I'll close my presentation. We'll be happy to get any questions, anything if you want to understand. Uh, yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening.